I never knew that I needed to see a fight between Blade and Miles Morales, but now that I have one, it's amazing. So what this does is this opens up with actually kind of a flashback from the Miles Morales tie-in for the Blood Hunt event. And what we talked about in the previous video that we did, which we'll link a playlist to it at the end of this, is Blade effectively made a move against the world where he took over the vampire nation and then used a variety of superpowered beings to essentially block out the sun, which gave normal vampires the ability to run amok on Earth. But before all of it started, he went and met with Miles, but we never actually found out what happened. Instead, Miles just kind of popped back up on the scene, and we'll cover the rest of that over the course of this video. But this flashback tells us that initially Miles fighting all these different vampires out here before the world kind of goes dark is he thinks one of them belongs to Ramir. Now, Ramir is a guy out there who uses basically energy vampires, and that's one of the things to know in Marvel Comics. There's all kinds of different vampires. You have your vampires that are traditional, so like they just suck on blood and they run around in the middle of the night and put a stake through their chest and like they're donezo. But then you also have characters like Celine, who is a mutant that's immortal, but she's also an energy vampire, meaning she siphons the life energies out of people. Michael Morbius and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on and on. And so when Blade hears this from Miles, he tells them these vampires that are out there are not the kind of vampires you're thinking of. And he says, but before I tell you what's going on, I have to change your perspective. And that's when Blade bites Miles Morales. Now, following that, a fight between the two of them breaks out, and Miles actually holds his own, which is a pretty impressive feat, because for those of you guys who are not familiar with the character of Blade, he actually came across Wolverine at one point in time. And while Wolverine didn't necessarily train Blade to the full extent of everything he knew, he did to a degree. Combine that with just the various forms of fighting that Blade has learned over the years, and he is prodigious. So much so that he's every bit as capable as guys like Captain America. In fact, I'd be curious to see what a knockdown, drag-out fight between like Steve Rogers and Blade would look like. But I say that to say, Blade is more than enough to hold his own against any traditional fighter in the Marvel Universe, not even taking into account his increased speed and strength and all that kind of stuff. And so Miles being able to hold it is really, really solid. Because the first thing that happens here, of course, is Blade basically just grabs him and like sends him flying, right? More like a distraction than anything else. But because of Miles' enhanced abilities, as well as the time that he spent working alongside Peter Parker leading up to Secret Wars in the Spiderman and Spider-Man 2 storyline from Brian Michael Bendis, and when he was brought into the main Marvel Universe after Secret Wars and the time that he's been here, he's very, very capable, right? So like one of the things he learned from Peter Parker is that fighting a Spider-Man is more than just cracking jokes, right? Peter Parker does that in order to throw his enemies off guard. We learned that from the Spider-Man Renew Your Vows storyline by Dan Slott. But when it came to fighting beyond that, it was also throwing them off guard by messing with their senses, moving so fast that it's difficult for them to keep up with. But with Blade, it doesn't work that way. That because Blade is so capable and Blade is so powerful, that he literally catches Miles almost every step of the way. But that's where things start to go awry, because when Miles goes for this attack with his Venom Blast, which should be enough to throw Blade off kilter or at the very least subdue him, because Miles was bitten by Blade, Miles is now a servant of Blade. And that's when Blade is able to stop Miles from what he's doing, right? Literally stop Miles from fighting. And that's why he says, close kid, but looks like that bite's finally taken hold. Vampirism is working its way through your system. I made you, which means I control you. Now, let's put that energy to better use, kid, because after all, you're now a fellow creature of the night, and I have need of you yet. And that's when Miles says yes, and just does what Blade tells him to. Now, what this does is this jumps back to basically the, I guess, follow-up to the ending of the last video that we did, which is Blood Hunt Part 2. Because with Blade and his forces basically taking out the Avengers, which he did, right? Like took out the Avengers pretty much by himself, that now he has them all held captive, or at least enough of them, right? He's got Thor, he's got the Scarlet Witch, and he's got Black Panther. Black Panther's particularly important because there's something within Wakanda that Blade is hunting for. But following that, he sends his forces kind of back out there into the world to basically round up whoever's next, but to also chase after Brielle. Now, Brielle is a character that we mentioned in the previous video that we did, and I kind of wanted to wait until now to really provide some clarity here. But Brielle Brooks is the daughter of Blade. She also goes by the name Bloodline. She was introduced in the actual Bloodline Daughter of Blade comic, and the way this played out is that in essence, essence, Blade's wife, girlfriend, however you want to look at it from the old Tomb of Dracula stories. But the long and short of this is that Blade's daughter was born without any indication that she was a vampire. She hadn't inherited any of her father's powers or anything like that. And so the way it was explained in the story is that Blade had traveled to meet Doctor Strange, and really as a request, Doctor Strange had done with Brielle what he did with Peter Parker in Brand New Day, or what is it, whatever the follow-up was to One More Day, where basically Doctor Strange wipes everybody's knowledge of Peter Parker's identity. That the same thing happens here, that he wipes the world's knowledge of really Brielle. More so than that, it's more like she cannot be detected through magic or anything along those lines, but it more or less serves the same purpose. What this did is it allowed Blade and his wife and his daughter to live some semblance of a normal life. But more recently, what Marvel had done is they had launched a story where Stephen Strange had died. It was literally the death of Doctor Strange. That allowed Clea to take over the role in his place. But with his death also came the deactivation of the spell, which means now everybody became aware of Brielle. And for the most part, it really just sort of led to Blade going and grabbing his daughter and then teaching her what she needed to know once her powers started to manifest, because he realized that given how capable she was and the fact that she was his daughter, people would come for her for any number of reasons. And so it was just kind of an end run way for Marvel to introduce a backstory that made some semblance of sense and then go forward from there. But that's where you also find out that Dracula, who had previously been the leader of the Vampire Nation, is kind of on the run now, right? That's what we learned in the first video, was that Blade has essentially taken over all the vampires across the world, because with Dracula, it was more of, we are vampires, we kind of have to play our part, right? Sitting in the darkness and running around at night and all that kind of good stuff. The Blade was more like, no, like we're going to conquer everything and we're going to rule the world. Now, Blade, as you see him here, is not really Blade, and we'll clarify that as we get further into it. It's not really him acting of his own faculties, which most people figured out within the first video that we did. But the fact is, Dracula is now hunting for Brielle because he realizes she's really the only person that can take the fight to Blade and essentially solve this. What's ironic is Brielle doesn't know her father is behind all of this. So it is really cool, but it is really interesting, and she does find out. But what you end up doing is switching over to Miles Morales. And Miles actually ends up meeting up with Tigra and Hunter's Moon, who of course are now kind of the leaders of the Midnight Mission after the death of Moon Knight in Marvel Comics. And so because of that, they all decide to go see Doctor Strange. But the reason why they do this is because when it comes to vampires in Marvel Comics, and really just the monster side of things, that's really just the Midnight Sun side of Marvel. Truth to tell, right? Ghost Rider, Blade, all that kind of stuff. And Doctor Strange to a degree. It's really been a Doctor Strange thing since the 1990s and like the formation of the Midnight Suns, Doctor Strange's Secret Defenders, that kind of thing. But it makes the most sense. The problem here is, as we saw in the last video, Doctor Strange was attacked by Blade and he was bitten and turned into a vampire. The beauty of this, and because of the nature of Stephen Strange being there with his wife Clea, what they're able to do is pull his spiritual form from his physical body. So his physical body is just running around like a vampire doing crazy vampire things and trying to tear up the whole house. But Doctor Strange himself can just appear as like a non-corporeal form. So it is interesting, right? It's a cool way to keep Doctor Strange in the story. It happens all the time. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Doctor Strange, like every time you crack open a book, his body is somehow destroyed and he just turns into a spirit and roams around for a while. But following that, the Avengers end up arriving on the scene, not to Doctor Strange proper, but basically to like Blade's Blood Coven, right? Which is kind of like Blade's anti-Avengers team, essentially. The whole reason why this fight takes place is to really just kind of give the Avengers some semblance of being able to marshal their forces, regather, and jump back out into the fight. Because again, like they were dominated with a quickness, right? As soon as Blade's forces showed up on the scene, the Avengers were taken out like that. One thing that I do want to point out is you do not see Steve Rogers here. He is in a tie-in for the main Avengers comic. He's not doing anything meaningful. He's fighting against Baron Blood. It's kind of a pointless story, which is sort of disappointing. This is one of those instances, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with comics, where Marvel is focusing more on Sam Wilson being Captain America than Steve Rogers because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So that's why you see Sam Wilson here as Captain America instead of Steve Rogers. But basically, like, the Avengers are able to hold their own against against these guys. Because one of the things to know is that you have one member of the Blood Coven that's snatched up by Vision. And one of these guys, right, this particular member is able to manipulate people's brain patterns. And while Vision is technically an android, his brain powers are based on Wonder Man's Simon Williams. So he's not that far removed from a human. The benefit of Vision is he can literally cycle his brain patterns at such a frequency that they just can't be locked onto, right? So it's like modulating shields so that nobody can ever actually break through those shields. But Vision ultimately cycles his brain patterns and ultimately just can't be locked onto. And so as a result of that, he's able to take one member of the Blood crew and fly them up into the sky. Now, this is where things are a little wonky. And the reason why I say that is because for those of you guys who read Secret Empire, where Captain America Steve Rogers was a Hydra agent and basically took over North America, one of the things they did is Steve Rogers used Dark Force energy to encapsulate the entirety of New York and move New York into the Dark Force dimension, basically a dimension of pure darkness. But Dark Force energy in Marvel Comics has been established in such a way to where there's no true means of escaping it. Instead, what's happening in this story is the role and the purpose of Dark Force energy is modified to where it's not that dissimilar from like Operation Dark Storm in the Matrix, where they block out the sun. That's effectively what happens here. So it's a change in how Dark Force energy is used. Not to say that it's right or wrong, but for those of you guys who are looking for some continuity between like older stories and this stories, it's one of those things where Marvel just kind of shifts it up. But the bigger point is one of these vampires is taken above the sky, they're exposed to the sun, and then of course they die the way that you would expect them to. And it just kind of gives the Avengers the upper hand, right? Like it rallies them and it's like, okay, cool, we've got a solid shot. And then at that point, you switch back to Miles Morales. And so Miles joining like Iron Man, Sam Wilson, the rest of the Avengers who have now arrived on the scene, that the whole idea is they're going to split up into groups. The issue with this is that immediately Miles activates as a vampire because that was the role that he was supposed to play. That he was sent in by Blade as essentially a Trojan horse. When all the superheroes gather together in one place, Miles can activate and Miles can attack. And it's an incredibly smart maneuver by Blade, because had it not been for Doctor Strange and Clea, it would have worked. Everybody would have died because it shows how capable Miles is. Now, the only reason Blade knows this, for those of you guys who have not been tracking Miles comics, is there was a point where Miles and Blade and Blade's daughter teamed up against some vampires. So Blade learned very, very fast how capable Miles Morales is. And as the guy that nobody suspects, he's the perfect Trojan horse. And so again, like as soon as this guy makes his move and starts attacking everybody, immediately Clea activates the Crimson Bands of Sidorak, which are enough to restrict Miles Morales. And then in turn, he's literally just like blasted with energy by Doctor Strange in a kind of spell, right? The Eye of Agamotto shows Miles the truth. And while it's not enough to cure him of his vampirism, it is enough to seemingly temporarily remove the effects of Blade controlling him, which brings him back to his normal self. And that's when Brielle is given the information that her father is the one behind all of this. Now, here's one of the interesting things here, is in a lot of ways it feels like with that revelation, the story is now less about Blade and more about his daughter. And I would say that as time goes on, that perspective will shift. Why? I'm not entirely sure. If I'm a betting man, I would say that like we're gonna learn that Wesley Snipes' Blade has a daughter in like the MCU because he's supposed to appear in the multiverse at some point in time. So I don't know how all that's gonna go down, right? No real indication there. Of course, we know that he was banging that one chick who was super hot back in the first Blade movie. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I love you to death. But it is one of those crazy moments, right? It is one of those cool little tidbits that we may end up getting. The important thing is that it's really more just the fact that so much pressure is put on her because now she's gonna have to be the one to track her father down and kill her father, right? So it's like the whole Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader type thing from Star Wars. You can see a lot of like pop culture themes are being rolled into this particular story in a variety of different ways. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is the groups basically start splitting off with each other and going after different facets of the vampire community in different ways, seeking out magical enchantments that can overcome the effects of Blade, seeking out ways to attack Blade directly. But more so than that, what the Avengers really intend to do is to kind of reassure the world. And I know it's sort of a lackluster statement, but the way that it happens is pretty dope, right? So when it comes to Sam Wilson's character as Captain America in Marvel Comics, yes, there was a lot of backlash from Rick Remender's run with the transition from Steve to Sam Wilson. I didn't really care, didn't really matter to me, because honestly, Captain America never really mattered to me that much. But within the comics themselves, that sort of real world backlash was recognized in the comic, where there was literally a comic book run called Not My Captain, which is what a lot of people were saying out there in the real world. But the fact is that Sam Wilson was never really welcomed as the new Captain America by just like the country as a whole, right? That they always saw just Steve Rogers as the only Captain America that was out there. And so he makes this kind of impassioned speech that spreads across the world, right? From like Halifax to the Impossible City, which used to be the Avengers headquarters and is now taken over by Blade, Manhattan, Mexico City, even within the confines of Asgard, where basically Moon Knight's team is, Latveria, Wakanda, where Black Panther is currently residing, kind of hiding away from everything. It's this big speech where, in essence, Sam Wilson basically tells the world, we have faced multiple threats over and over and over again. We've faced off Null, the symbiote god. We've faced off against Galactus. We've done all these things, right? And every single time we rallied together and we always came out on top. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. It's a pretty rousing speech. I mean, it's not the greatest thing ever, right? You know, again, it's just kind of Marvel looking to sort of keep the profile of Sam Wilson high, given the fact that he's got his own movie coming out next year. But the thing here is that what they're really looking for and what's really important is T'Challa the Black Panther, because what Blade has been hunting for most of this time is an artifact, and it's an artifact that existed within Wakanda since the fall of old Atlantis. Now, to sidetrack here for a second, this is a really cool bit of history in Marvel Comics, right? So just kind of bear with me. You'll find it pretty fascinating. Of course, as most people who read Marvel Comics know, you've got Namor the Submariner and you have Atlantis. At one point in time, Atlantis was literally an island out there in the Atlantic Ocean. What ended up happening is that when the Celestials initially showed up on Earth and they basically created the Eternals and the Deviants, they left, right? That initial creation was called the First Host. They also planted the genes for mutants at some point in time. Once they came back with the second host, the Deviants, who had basically taken over the world, had attacked the Celestials. The Celestials basically obliterated pretty much all the Deviants, but in the process initiated something called the Great Cataclysm, which was the sinking of Atlantis. A lot of magical artifacts and a lot of magical history on Earth in Marvel Comics was lost in the sinking of Atlantis. But people like Selene, people like Merlin, those folks actually survived the sinking of Atlantis and then took up residence in different ways within Marvel Comics. But it's just a cool little bit of history there, right? Something kind of fascinating, which all of it is to simply just say this artifact that Blade is looking for within Wakanda has been around since before Wakanda was even a formed nation, since before anybody settled there, and before there was ever even the concept of a Black Panther. And of course, he successfully locates it. And what he ends up doing is dropping this artifact off in the middle of Central Park in New York City, because the idea is seemingly once it's activated, this kind of temple of the first blasphemy, all hell's gonna break loose. Now, what it is and what this thing is capable of is pretty dope, which we'll find out in the next video. But thank you for watching, guys. If you are digging this, make sure you click this link to the playlist to get caught up, and I will catch you all later. Peace.